Was that a yeah? Okay, good. Hey, so y'all know how on TV there are these advertisements, like the infomercials for, like the slap chop and knives and like there's that thing where it's like if you put this on your boat that has a giant hole in it, like if you put this rubber black stuff on your boat, like you can sail to China. Like, I don't know why. Like, it's weird how many, like, this infomercial thing, it's weird how often, like, they think that I have a boat. Because I don't have a boat. And I don't know why they think that, like, that's a target audience for them, is people awake at 3 in the morning who can't sleep, they all have boats. I don't know why that's what they think. But it's a thing, and I don't know if you guys have seen it. But you know what I'm talking about, like the made-for-TV stuff. Well, you know how they're always like, it's $19.99. But wait, there's more. Like, and it's like, then they give you like 3 more products. Like, not only can you sail to China, but here is this meat grinder for on your way when you're grinding your meat on your trip to China in the boat that has the black stuff on the bottom. We all know what I'm talking about, right? So that's a thing that happens. And here's what I just need to tell you. I always assume that it's like that those products are terrible. Like, I assume that if a product needs to be sold with another product, or if a product has to be $19.99, or if you have to really, even if you have to sell me on a product, like if you have to like really super convince me that a product is awesome, I'm just going to assume it's not awesome, because I'm going to guess that if your product actually was awesome, you didn't need to try to sell me on it. You could have just said, hey, Drew, here's the product, enjoy your product. Right? Like, that's what I think. So I guess what I'm saying is, like, I just always assume that, like, and wait, there's more. Like, you pay for one thing and you get 2. I'm just always assuming that both products are absolute garbage. This is what I always assume. And I bring this up this morning because this morning you're getting 2 sermons for the price of 1. Just getting 2 of them. You paid for 1 with your $0 at the door, but you're getting 2. $19.99, but wait, there's more. And so here's the deal. You're getting a second sermon because we need the first sermon to explain the second one. Because the second sermon is actually a really dangerous sermon. And I know you guys probably are thinking, Drew, sermons aren't dangerous. Mountain lions are dangerous. I know. But sermons can also be dangerous, just in a different way as mountain lions. Sermons are like the wrong kind of sermon, the wrong understanding, the wrong teaching about the Bible, and you can end up with just the absolute wrong idea about God. And the thing about it is this: I think a lot of times we think about our understanding of God as in some way impacting God, and it doesn't. Like, if you get God totally wrong, that doesn't change who God is. If you just believe like 100% everything incorrectly about God, in no way does that impact God. You don't have that ability. Like, as human beings, as people, we don't have the ability to change who God is. But what we do have the ability to do is change who we are. And terrible theology will always change us for the worse. Always. If we believe the wrong thing about God, we will always be worse people. We will always be people who don't have peace or don't have joy or don't have, hope. I mean, all the things that one would think you get from believing in God, like the whole point that we all believe in God. If we get stuff wrong, sure enough, we'll lose some of that, or sometimes all of it. And so this sermon, the second sermon of the day, is dangerous because it's one of those sermons that always kind of lends itself towards people believing really dumb things and really dangerous things. And because that second sermon is that way, we need to have our first sermon, okay? So here we go. Bonus first sermon. We got to start right here. We're going to start this sermon with a Bible verse. We're going to do this the old school Baptist way. Here's just a Bible verse, and we'll just start it that way. And the Bible verse goes like this. It's in John chapter 10. This is something that Jesus said in the middle of a sermon. And Jesus says this. Jesus says, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I come that they may have life and have it abundantly. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Now we got to back up a little bit, get our bearings, figure out in the context that's going on here and why Jesus is saying this. So one day Jesus goes to Jerusalem and he just hangs out for a while. For like months, he hangs out in Jerusalem. And we think he did that because Jesus liked going to festivals. He liked going to the Jewish, religious holiday stuff. And there was a couple of festivals that were just right kind of next to each other. And it made sense if you go to the first one, just hang out for a couple of months if you don't have anything else to do, and then you can end up at the second one. So there's the Feast of Booths and the Feast of Tabernacles. I believe the two. Yeah, I think we're just going to say that is and assume, Booths and Tabernacles. I don't know why in my head I just thought maybe I'm getting that wrong. So the Feast of Booths and the Feast of Tabernacles. One of them is a celebration and a commemoration of the Exodus, which is obviously a very, very big deal to the Jewish people with their history of, becoming a nation. Without the Exodus, they're not a nation at all. They're always just slaves. And specifically, it's a celebration of God's provision in the Exodus and then God's provision as they are in the wilderness afterwards. And then the Feast of Tabernacles is this celebration celebrating. It's sort of like Jewish Independence Day. Okay, it's celebrating an event that happened somewhere in the neighborhood of 165 years or so before Jesus was born, when the Greeks had, were the tyrants, and they were the people who owned Israel essentially. And there were these people called the Maccabees. You may recognize that from a Friends episode where he's the holiday armadillo. And he's like, it's the Maccabees. So those guys, they were real. Turns out that joke was based on real history. And the Maccabees, they revolt and they win their freedom over the Greek people for, at least a temporary amount of time. So that festival is celebrating the independence of the people of Israel. And so you have these two big holidays that are very, very big. It's a very, very big deal to the Jewish people. It's sort of a time of year, and if you're kind of at the festival, if you're at the place, it's a time that kind of reminds you of your own, like your own national pride. Like you're very kind of, you're standing a little taller. Your head's up because you're remembering the glory days of your people, the time in which you, led by God, were people who, did wonderful and amazing things. And so Jesus goes to Jerusalem. And he hangs out there, and he goes to both festivals. And in between the two festivals, he fights with the Pharisees. Because, that's just what Jesus always does. It's not really Jesus' fault. Like, they always want to fight with him. But Jesus also has little to no issue engaging, and so that's sort of what happens. And one day, in the midst of all of this, a debate, a fight, a problem arises over a particularly difficult theological idea that the people of Israel had. So the way the people of Israel understood God and life and people goes something like this. If you're a good person, your life will go well because good things happen to good people. And if you're a bad person, then your life will go badly because bad things happen to bad people. Which means if you end up in a situation in your life where something terrible happens, some sort of tragedy, some sort of illness, some sort of disease, some sort of loss, some sort of anything, well, tough, that's probably what you deserve because you're a dirty sinner. Like, they maybe not put it that way because they were maybe a little more tactful, but that's what they meant. Like, it's your fault that bad thing happened. And of course, the opposite is true also, that if good things are happening to you, if you don't end up sick or you don't end up, destitute, if you don't have terrible losses, well, then that just means that God loves you a little more than he loves other people because you are a good person. And you can understand why people think that. I mean, you understand like that. There's a certain degree of sense in, like you reap what you sow. And, if you do the right thing, right things happen back. Like there's a certain degree to which, like, taking God out of it, we all sort of believe that, right? Like if you do the right thing, well, then right things will happen to you. And we all sort of get bent out of shape when we do the right thing and bad things happen. And we're like, well, that's not fair. No, it's not. That's called life. Regardless. The people of Israel really struggled with certain parts of this. There were sort of exceptions to the rule that were difficult. And one day, Jesus and his disciples run across somebody who is a really kind of a sticky wicket to this. This guy actually was born blind from birth. And I said born from birth twice, not to be redundant, but so that way you understood. Blind. So the problem is this. They would normally say a disability like being blind, well, that is something that happens because somebody sins, right? Like that's exactly, I mean, that is, you done messed up 101 as far as, you did a bad thing and here's a bad thing that comes back to you, right? That is exactly what they would think, a disability like that. But the problem is, like, what sin could somebody who's just born, what sin could they have committed? Like, how can a baby sin? And even more to the point, how can a baby who hasn't even been born yet sin? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. So in sort of the theological world, there were a couple of different ideas. There were some people who just held on to this idea that, yeah, the baby messed up, it's on the baby somehow, and we don't understand exactly how, but it happened. But there are other people who said, well, so that was probably like the parent's sin that got passed down to the baby, or maybe the grandparent's sin, or some family member's sin, gets passed on to this baby, and that's God punishing the family or the parents in the body of this baby. And of course, people argue because, if you say, well, the baby did it, well, there's still the obvious problem of how. Like that doesn't seem to make any sense. But then if you say, well, it's the parents, then you're also stuck saying, well, that means that God is punishing other people for the sins of a different person. Like God is saying, person A sinned, I'm going to punish person B, which seems not fair at all and doesn't seem like it fits in the theology of you reap what you sow and bad things happen to bad people and good things happen to good people, right? Like that seems to sort of blow up the whole system. So this guy is a problem to this theology. And so the disciples they see this guy, and they decide to ask Jesus, hey, man, Jesus seems to be answering all the questions for us. They probably hadn't thought of it really before because, let's be honest, those of us who are able-bodied don't think a lot about disabilities until it's just right in front of us. And so they hadn't really thought about it. They see this guy who's disabled, and they ask Jesus, hey, man, settle this. Who sinned? Was it the guy, or was it his parents? And Jesus gave an answer that was sort of crazy. Jesus said, neither sinned. I don't know where you came up with the idea of sin at all here. This is not a conversation about sin. And in fact, he said that man's blindness will in fact show the glory of God, which is sort of a crazy notion because this disability is obviously a bad thing. It's something that's it's a difficult thing. It's something that makes obviously his life harder, makes his life difficult for everybody else. Anybody who might be helping him, it makes their lives harder. That's not the sort of thing that you would think would ever be able to show God's glory. And yet that's exactly what Jesus claims. And then he goes ahead and heals the guy because, well, he's Jesus. And Jesus' healing of this man, born blind, creates a giant fight between the religious leaders who are now aware of this going on and Jesus. The religious leaders end up really holding on to their understanding of this guy must have been born a sinner. They end up actually telling the guy that because they're not very nice. You were born a sinner. There's just this giant fight that ends up ensuing from it. And on the back end of that fight, Jesus ends up preaching a sermon because, again, he's Jesus. That's what Jesus does. And the sermon Jesus preaches is the sermon of the Good Shepherd. Now, again, he's talking to these people, and this is the context that's in the background, and this is everything that's going on. As he talks about the Good Shepherd, we need to understand a couple of things. God as shepherd and God's people as sheep is a very, very old and very common illustration. If you say, I am the good shepherd and God's people are my sheep, everyone understands what you're saying. You're not saying I'm a really good guy. You're not saying I'm literally a shepherd. You are saying I'm doing the work of God, or even more directly, I am God. They all understood this is a claim of divinity for Jesus here. And as he goes on to explain exactly, what he means by this, he gets to that passage that we read, where he's comparing and contrasting what he does and, in the illustration, what a thief who might be trying to steal the sheep, because we're talking about an illustration of a shepherd here, what a thief in a pasture might be doing. And he says that the thief comes to steal and kill and destroy. But differently than that, separately from that, Not doing those things, Jesus says, I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly. So we put these pieces together. What Jesus is saying is, if we're talking about the good shepherd being the idea of God, right? God is not the thief. God does not do the things the thief does. And I don't know who the thief is exactly, let's be honest. I mean, it's an illustration. It could be all sorts of people. A lot of times you'll hear people talk about it's Satan. That's a good one. A lot of times people say, well, it's sin or it's death. Also good ones. I like to think that he's referring to the thief as the religious leaders because I think Jesus is hilarious. I don't know. Who knows? But what he's saying is God is not the thief, and it is the thief who kills and steals and destroys. As bluntly as I can put it, what Jesus is saying is that God does not steal or kill or destroy. God does not do that. In fact, the opposite is true. What God does, Jesus, the good shepherd, that we understand who he is, he gives us life and gives it abundantly. And oh, by the way, he does that in a specific way. He says that the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. On this side of the cross, we are, of course, thinking of the cross, right? Jesus dies so that we might live. But if we can actually see something, I think there's something even cooler here. We can understand the illustration of a shepherd. A shepherd spends his entire life with the sheep. Like, you don't just clock out and are like, well, I'll just leave the sheep out here. That's not, you're going to lose your sheep. That's not how it's going to work. To lay down one's life as a shepherd means I will commit my life to being with you. And what Jesus is saying is, yes, of course, Jesus dies on the cross. We're not, that's great. But Jesus also lives with and for and around his people. Jesus has chosen to do that, which is really kind of a neat concept when we recognize that Jesus is God. God is an infinite being. God can do anything. God literally created the concept of reality. God created all that we call anything. Anything that we see around us it all comes from God, right? God can do anything. God doesn't have to do anything. And yet God chooses to be with us. God chooses to spend time with us, the Holy Spirit indwells within us, to save us, to guide us, to lead us. God could do anything, but the Good Shepherd lays down his life, meaning God sacrifices his time and effort to be with us. And I think that is really cool. But as bluntly as I can put it, the most important thing that we can say, in fact, the point of our sermon this morning, the first one, in our second week of our series called Philip the Forgotten, and we haven't even talked about him yet because he's not in the first sermon because I forgot him. Man, I thought of that joke and I was like, that's going to be killer. Love it. It's so good. Our second lesson, which is from our first sermon this morning, is this. We need to keep this in the forefront of our minds for the rest of us. God does not cause our pain. God only helps and gives life and light and love. Let me say that again. If you hear nothing else from the first sermon, please hear this. God does not cause our pain. No one sinned for this blind guide and for this to happen. God does not cause our pain. God only ever helps and gives life and light and love. But wait, there's more. So one day, Jesus and his disciples were traveling, and Jesus got hungry because, Jesus is a person and people get hungry. And they get hungry, and he's tired, and he decides he needs to rest, and he rests in a place called Sychar. Now, Sychar is a fun little name for a town, but the thing about Sychar is it was in a place called Samaria. And as we've talked about just a whole lot over the past year, Samaritans and Jews don't get along with one another. People from Samaria and people from Israel don't get along. So usually Jewish people don't travel through Samaria at all. I mean, like you can if you're going to Jerusalem, but usually they don't. And if they do travel through, they don't stay long. Jesus both travels through and decides to stay long. And Jesus is hungry and he's tired. And so he's like, look, disciples, the 12 of you, here's what you all need to do. I'm going to sit right here by this well. It is nice and shady. It is a nice place to sit. I'm going to do that. And you guys go get me some lunch. The disciples was like, great. Yeah, we'll go get some lunch in Samaria. I guess you'll just hang out there, Jesus. And so that's what they did. And it's then that Jesus met a woman who was at the well for all of the normal reasons, and that is she was getting water. And Jesus, strikes up a conversation with the woman at this well because, well, he's Jesus, and that's the sort of thing Jesus does. And he talks to her, and he asks her for a drink of water, and she's like, why are you talking to me? You're Jewish. Stop it. Like, this, Jewish people don't talk to Samaritans. I don't know, why are you asking me this? Please stop. And Jesus, because he's Jesus, doesn't really please stop. He just keeps talking to her. And what ends up happening is this really fascinating conversation. This happens a lot of times with Jesus, where it's almost like a who's on first level misunderstanding, where Jesus is like trying to talk to somebody about, a deep spiritual thing, and the other person is just in a completely different world, taking it way too literally. So like Jesus, he talked to her and he's like, hey, I would give you living water, and then you would never thirst again. Which is clearly not, we're not talking about water from a well, guys. But the woman's like, living water? You can't give me living water. You don't have a rope and a bucket. That's why you asked me in the first place. Why am I even talking to you? This whole thing, this whole misunderstanding between the two of them, where she gets very focused on who Jesus is, him trying to talk to her about other things, and she's very literal, and he's not being literal at all, and it's this whole thing. Eventually, though, the conversation makes a turn. Like, something happens in the conversation. It stops in a dime. It turns, and she finally understands, here's a guy I should be talking to. And they end up having these, really fascinating theological conversations. He ends up telling her that, the Jews and the Samaritans, for all of their differences, as much as they're arguing with each other, that they worship the same God, which is mind-blowing, because that's going to just upset both the Samaritans and the Jews. Nobody wants to hear you worship the same God as your religious rivals, but Jesus said it. And he says, by the way, it doesn't matter what you could worship in your temple or they can worship in their temple. None of that matters. Boy, does it not matter. What matters is if you're worshiping in spirit and in truth. And the woman's like, man, you're just going to upset everyone. Keep that to yourself, even if it's true. Don't do that. Jesus, it's just this really fascinating conversation. Jesus ends up, this is the first person he just flat says, I'm the Messiah to. He just tells her straight up that, yes, I am actually, I'm the Messiah. I'm here to save everybody. Just know that's what's going on. Which is a fascinating concept, because the Samaritans understood the Messiah to be fundamentally different than the Jews did. And yet Jesus just says, hey, I'm the guy that you're both looking for. Which, again, is just really crazy. It's just this massively interesting theological conversation. But like I said, at first, it wasn't a good conversation at all, because Jesus was thinking about, he was talking about things from a very spiritual, a metaphoric, poetic kind of a way, and she was listening to him from a very literal, very, black and white sort of, where is your bucket for the water kind of a way. And something ends up changing the conversation. And it's something I don't think we talk about enough in this very famous story. And when we do, I think we talk about it wrong. But this is actually what makes the change in the conversation and changes the whole thing. It's again in the book of John. This time it's in John chapter 4. And this is what we read is the conversation between the two of them. Go and get your husband, Jesus told her. I don't have a husband, the woman replied. Jesus said, you're right. You don't have a husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and you aren't even married to the man you live with now. You certainly spoke the truth. Sir, the woman said, you must be a prophet. That is the moment that sort of changes everything, where Jesus gives her information about herself that, unless he's just stalking her or something, and that would be hard to do as a Jewish person in Samaria, he would have no way of knowing. And yeah, okay, maybe she's it's the Scarlet Letter and everybody knows who this woman is, but Probably not. So what's happening here is Jesus ends up telling this woman a fun fact, not so fun fact, about her life. And he ends up talking to her about, who she is and what she's been through. And because of that, she now listens to him and says, well, you must be a prophet. But here's the thing I think we don't often talk about. Jesus could have said, like, your favorite color is purple. He didn't know that either. He could have said, you eat your lamb medium well instead of medium rare. You don't like that mint sauce either. He could have said that. Like, no one knew that. Jesus could have said literally anything to this woman. Like, your shoe size is 14. They had different shoe sizes in ancient Israel. I just made that up. I have no idea shoe sizes. But 14 seems like a really big shoe for a woman. That wouldn't be a secret. If she was really size 14, they would just look down and, like, there's frying pans. And he'd be like, oh, okay. Yeah, I see that. Like, he could have said literally anything to her at all about anything. And as long as it was a secret, as long as it was, your favorite, your best friend when you were a kid was Esther, but you stopped being friends when she shoved you down on the playground. Like, he could have said anything to her. And yet he brings up the single worst part of her life. And understand, he brings up something that is just a horrific cause of pain in her life. Look, we don't know why she had 5 husbands. We don't know. But we also know that if the Jewish way of looking at pain that we talked about in our first sermon is accurate, it doesn't actually matter why she no longer has these husbands. Let's say for a second that all 5 men died. All 5 husbands died. Okay? She's a widow 5 times over. According to Jewish theology, that is her fault for being a sinner. She must have done something to invite this into her life 5 times, and no man should ever marry her because that's going to happen again. Right? I mean, that's the way their understanding of sin and theology and good things and bad things work. She is going to be blamed for 5 men dying that way. She must have done something. You'd better repent. That's an option. It could also be she's been divorced 5 times. And even then, it's the same thing. Again, why did the men leave you? And by the way, while we're on the subject, that's exactly the way that conversation has to be in the ancient world. We often think about, well, why is the Bible so harsh about divorce of all things? Like, why is divorce such a terrible thing? Well, the reason is because in the ancient world, men and women weren't equal. Like, you basically bought your wife like she was a cow. You got enough money for the dowry, you get the milk cow. That's just the way it is. So, for a divorce to happen means a powerful person, a man with authority and with clout in society, with a legal right to do so, is sending away a not powerful person, a woman who has no legal ability to say yes, no, or anything. The woman is entirely passive in this contract, right? So if that's the way that it is, divorce is, of course, a terrible evil to do because it is a powerful person harming a not powerful person. It is somebody without legal protections being hurt by somebody with legal protections. This woman, that happened to 5 times. Maybe. I mean, more likely we've got some sort of widowing and some sort of divorcing back. Probably you've got maybe 1 died or 2 died and you got some divorces or whatever. But regardless, the bottom line is this woman has been victimized in as bad a way as a person can be victimized in that world 5 separate times. It is no wonder that when man number 6 comes along, she's like, look, maybe we don't get married. Or more likely, given the power dynamics of that world, man number 6 says, I am not marrying you. You are used goods, you are damaged, and you're going to get me killed. Regardless, this 5 divorce, 5 death, 5 widow, 5 being cast out, whatever it is, these ending of the marriages, this is the most painful thing in this woman's life. And Jesus chooses to bring that up. And he didn't have to, he could have brought up anything. But he brought that up. Man, I thought for a long time. Why? Like, why bring that up? Why not go with the I know how you like your lamb, or I know your childhood best friend, or like, why not do that? And I think there's a really powerful answer to that. And that answer is in the way Jesus spoke to her. She wasn't the least bit offended by it. Like, did you notice that? She doesn't say, how dare you bring this up? She doesn't say, I can't believe you talk about that. She says, man, you must be a prophet. The way Jesus spoke to this woman about her pain was respectful. It gave her agency. It gave her dignity. Jesus treated her as a human being, worthy of love and compassion, as he spoke to her about her pain. That's at least how she understood it. She wasn't in the least bit offended by it. In fact, not only is she not offended by it, but this is how we read the story ends. This is what later in John chapter 4, this is what we read happens, okay? It says, the woman left her water jar beside the well, and she ran back to the village, telling everyone, come and see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could he possibly be the Messiah? So the people came streaming from the village to see him. A little bit later, it says, many Samaritans from the village believed in Jesus because the woman had said, he told me everything I ever did. When they came out to see him, they begged him to stay in the village. So he stayed for 2 days, long enough for many more to hear his message and believe. The entire purpose of what was going on here, the entire reason this woman went and told anybody about Jesus in the first place was because Jesus talked to her about her pain. It's not just that she's not offended at her pain being brought up, but the way Jesus addresses it actually makes her excited. It's like the first time anyone's looked at her like a person and not a victim. It's like the first time anybody's ever said, like, you're still loved even though this happened. And she's just stoked. She can't get it. I mean, she's running to go tell people, you got to go talk to this guy. The message is so clear. Jesus doesn't shy away from this woman even though she's hurting. And as a result of Jesus not shying away from this woman even though she is hurting, her hurt becomes something else. Her pain becomes something beautiful. People end up believing in Jesus. Jesus hangs out for 2 days in Sychar, in Samaria. And people believe in Jesus because this woman told them to. And the only reason this woman told them to is because Jesus talked to her about her pain, which is a fancy way of saying this. Had this woman not had 5 divorces or 5 widows or some combination therein, had this woman not suffered, this story never happens. Her pain and her suffering gets turned into something better. God did not cause it. Remember our first sermon. But God certainly used it for something great. Fast forward a little bit of time. Jesus lives, he dies, he raises from the dead, he ascends to heaven, the church begins, the church does its thing, 3,000 people baptized the first day, 5,000 people the next time is where we're at. We've got thousands of people, everything's great, and then one day there's a man named Stephen. And Stephen, he takes a hornet's nest. You know how, you see like a hornet's nest on like a tree? Like he takes that and he starts shooting it with a BB gun. And when that's not enough, he takes a sledgehammer. And before long, he's being attacked by hornets and he dies, which is a fancy way of saying Stephen is the first Christian martyr. So he dies for his faith. And before long, and by that, like the next day, the religious leaders of Israel begin to persecute the church in earnest. For the first time, they say, you know what, enough of these guys. And they go house to house, and they start arresting people on the charge of blasphemy, and they do everything they can to stamp out the early church and make it not a thing. They may have done it, quite frankly, had the church not responded by escaping. They left. They were all in Jerusalem at that point, but at this point, they leave, and they go elsewhere. And they become religious refugees, so to speak. People just looking for a home. I mean, they lost their house. They don't just lose their religious place. They lose where they literally live. And so they have to go elsewhere and find, hospitality wherever they can, which Jesus taught them to do, luckily. And that's what they do. And there's a guy by the name of Philip. Philip, a man we often forget, because as we discussed 2 sermons ago, but also last week, we talked about how Philip is a guy who shares a name with an apostle. So usually people, when they see the word Philip, they think, oh, it's, one of the 12. It's not in this case. And he's in the book of Acts, and we always forget him. But Philip, even though we forget who he is, has a really powerful ministry. And this is what we read happens with Philip in his ministry after they all spread out. This is what we read. Book of Acts, chapter 8, it says, "But the believers who were scattered preached the good news about Jesus wherever they went. Philip, for example, went to the city of Samaria and told the people there about the Messiah. Crowds listened intently to Philip because they were eager to hear his message and see the miraculous signs he did. Many evil spirits were cast out, screaming as they left their victims." I love that detail. It's like Halloween. "And many who had been paralyzed or lame were healed. So there was great joy in that city." Philip ends up preaching in a city called Samaria. So it's like New York, there is a Samaria. He goes to Samaria, and he goes to this city, and he preaches. And it says there's great joy in the city because of him. Evil spirits cast out, people healed, people believing, people getting baptized. We're going to talk about one of those guys next week. People getting baptized, just the whole 9 yards, the church being exactly what it's supposed to be, the church spreading to this place. And 100% for sure, none of that happens without the pain and suffering of Stephen. And 100% of that, none of that happens without the pain and suffering of the early church. And God did not cause that pain and suffering. Remember our first sermon this morning. God does not do it. It's not what happens. The thief steals and kills and destroys. God does not. But God certainly used it. And here's a fun little thing. I love this. This is great. This is so interesting. If you look at an ancient map and you look at where Sychar is and where Samaria is, it's like that on a map. It's like that. And it's just about the mileage from Ashland to Columbia. I mean, it's just like they're just next door neighbors to end all next door neighbors. The Bible doesn't say it, but I refuse to believe that those folks that the woman told about Jesus and then Jesus preached to those people, that they weren't waiting for Philip to show up at one town over and saying, "Hey, man, so glad you're here. These people want to hear the truth too." Which means we have the woman's pain now helping in Samaria. We have Stephen's pain in Samaria. We have the woman's pain in Sychar. We have these 2 towns impacted by the gospel of Christ. They're filled with joy. They're set free from oppression. And it's all because of suffering. It's suffering on top of suffering being made new. Here's the point. God does not cause our suffering. And I got to tell you, if you believe that God does cause your suffering, you will make yourself miserable. It is so hard to love and trust an infinite, eternal being who's like a kid with a magnifying glass and ants. It's so hard. And I've seen people my whole life try that. Well, I love God. I mean, he gave me this illness, but I mean, I love God. God gave me cancer. God took my wife. But I love God. No, you don't love God. You're afraid of God. You're trying not to cross him, is what you're trying to do. And look, if God is he's running around giving people cancer and, taking people's wives and if God, like all the acts of God that the insurance companies say are actual acts of God, like God's just running around like chucking trees on people's rooftops, like if that's who God is, yeah, we should be afraid of that God. I mean, think about the pettiness of that God. Like, well, these people I'm going to leave alone today, but these people, they're going to get the full, like, it's just crazy. It's a crazy notion. And of course, it means so, like, if that's what we believe, and so many people take the Bible and do that with it, when that's what we believe, it just destroys any level of hope that we have. But when we recognize that Jesus himself directly, verbatim says it is the thief, whatever that is, whoever that is, it's not God. The thief steals and kills and destroys, not God. Well, I don't know that I can explain a whole lot more, but I can at least stop blaming God for things. And when I stop blaming God for things, I can start seeing the beauty of what God does with our pain. You see, the Good Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. That's not just the cross, that's also every day. The Good Shepherd is with us in our pain, in our difficulty, in our agony. We still suffer, sure, but we don't do it alone. And at the end of the day, our pain never has the final word. Death, stealing, destruction never has the final word. The final word is a God who takes from pain and makes something beautiful. That's the final word. And that's at the core of who we understand God to be. That's at the core of the ministry of Philip the Forgotten. And that's our hope this morning. This morning, we're in our second, maybe third week of our series. Second week, third sermon of our series. There's no more. Of our series called Philip the Forgotten. And guys, this is tough. I mean, it's tough. You look at this, and we live our lives, and I'm not pretending it's not tough. I'm not pretending like it's an easy thing to embrace and accept that. Look, I can trust God even though bad. Because you think, well, why isn't God stopping it, or why is this not? And I'm not saying I have answers. I'm just saying Jesus said that it's not Him, and so we can trust the God who is with us and redeems our pain and makes something better out of it. Our second/third lesson of our series called Philip the Forgotten then is this: God does not stop His work of bringing us light in life simply because we are in pain. Let's say that again. God does not stop His work of bringing us light in life simply because we are in pain. He is still working no matter what. This morning, the musicians are going to come forward. We're going to sing a song. We're going to offer an invitation each and every week. Take God up on His offer to embrace the beauty of who God is, the hope that He offers us in by repenting and being baptized. That sounds like two things. It's really just one. In repentance, we are turning our backs on who we used to be. We are changing our minds. We are saying, I want things God's way. The Bible teaches that in baptism, we align ourselves with Christ. We want to be with Christ in His life, His death, His resurrection, just as He promises He is with us in His Spirit. The Bible teaches that when we go down to the water, it's like our old selves being put to death. We get out of the water, it's our new selves being born again. We are given His Spirit. We are forgiven of sin. We're made brand new. Never made the decision. We got a nice warm baptistry. All sorts of folks to do it. And yeah, we'd love to talk. If you're an immersed believer in Christ, you're looking for a perfect church home, this place is not it. But we do serve a perfect God. We want to connect, we want to call, we want to cultivate, we want to meet new people, we want to share the gospel, and we want to grow up while we do it. And more than anything, we want to be people who see God for who He is, for recognizing His beauty, His grace, His hope, and the life that He gives us all. As we stand,